one of our book club on a people's future of the United States and various selections. And so today we are focusing on four of them. And so Jamel's going to give us a quick introduction to all four stories. Go ahead, Jamel.
Sure. And so we tried to, when we got an anthology like this, we tried to go about it and group them according to some themes. And so week one, ideas, ideology, and the sharing of knowledge. And so the four stories that we wanted to focus on are related to that. The very first one, and that's the first book in the anthology, is The Bookstore at the End of America. Um, and the basic premise is America has essentially split into two countries with very different ideologies. Some might consider it red and blue, but it's even more extreme than that, I would say. And there's a bookstore that sits on the border of the two countries. People are able to go in um, and go to the sections that they choose. Um, War breaks out while there are patrons inside the bookstore, and they kind of hunker down in there. There's some family related discussions and discussions about young people and older people. But the interesting thing for us as a book club is that during this war, they decide they are going to essentially have a book club, and they have to pick out a book that they're going to read. And that's what goes on in that story. Read After Burning is I found that one a little bit uh, harder to digest, but conceptually, it's about a dystopia or a future time when books and even certain phrases become illegal, and a group of people who are resisting this, a group of resistance fighters, essentially are tattooing books on their bodies so that they become books in and of themselves as a way of preserving the concepts and preserving the books. No Algorithms in the World is one of the shorter pieces. It's actually it's very interesting. It's basically a discussion between a father who might be a little bit old school and a son who might be a little bit more progressive. But it's set in a society that provides a universal basic income, and many people have access to free food and do not need to work to survive. And traditional for-profit businesses still exist, and the adult, the man, is kind of disgruntled, or the father is kind of disgruntled that some people are getting things free in this world and not working. And his son basically says that at some point he feels like there isn't really work for him to do, and he's actually happy uh, to to retire from his job, and to do something new. So we'll get into some questions that are raised by that book as well, or by that story. And the last one, The Sun in Exile, is the world is in the midst of flooding and extreme rising temperatures, something that clearly is talking about climate change. And a charismatic leader wears heavy coats and blankets to the public to appear and convince his constituents that it's actually cold. And in that one, it's called The Sun in Exile. It's because the leader actually takes the sun to court and says the sun is failing in its responsibility to keep us all warm at a time when everybody is actually very hot. So it's an absurdist kind of story, but it's definitely an allegory, and we'll talk a little bit about that and some of the questions that we have. So if you haven't had a chance to read those stories yet, or if you focused on some others, we wanted to go through a quick synopsis. But the questions that we put together, mostly through Robin, I'll say she's done a great job putting them together, are things that I think touch on some universal themes, so that even if you haven't had a chance to read, you should still be able to participate in the discussion.
Thank you, Jamel. And I should note at the bottom of your screen, you should have your Zoom screen. You may have an option to turn on captioning if you would like to turn on closed captioning. So that option is available to you as an individual if you would like to enable that. All right, and we are going to get started with our questions. And so Robin, before you do that, I'll just give that gentle reminder that we ask that you keep your responses to 2 to 3 minutes and try to keep that response to the question at hand, just so that our discussions flow in a way that we can all benefit from. So Robin is going to get us started with our first set of questions. And we're going to try something new where we're sharing our screen because our questions are more detailed and kind of like go, they all combine. And so I'm going to keep my screen shared so that way you can see the questions and whatnot. So Robin, take it away.
So I apologize, everyone. I felt that the questions kind of related to each other, and so that's why I lumped them together in this fashion. So I hope this is okay. Like Wes said, we're trying something new this time. So I'm just going to read all 3 of the questions before we get started. And if you have a response to any of the 3 or a combination of them, then please feel free to respond to those. Stories and literature often reflect a society's culture and values. As societies evolve and change, so do the language, standards, mores, and ideals of that society. Thinking back over the past 100 years or so, what are some of the ways that stories have changed, including what stories we tell about, and how we tell those stories? So the second question, should classic books be edited to remove controversial and potentially harmful content? So you may notice if you have already looked at the Reader's Guide, there was a recent controversy about Roald. I've read his name a million times and never had to say it out loud. Roald Dahl's books where they had been edited to remove content that was deemed controversial. I'm not sure if it had made the news. I actually came across it while reading, but Ender's Game has also been edited, and they edited out the N-word out of that book as well. So that one did come up in the first story, so that's what drove that question. So the third part, what are some ways to discuss classic literature and past social conventions without causing further harm to marginalized communities?
What struck me about these, and the questions are, I don't have them very well organized in my brain, but mostly what was obvious to me is that the conflicts that we're having today are really what we've struggled with forever. And I saw myself also in the California piece being a lot more judgmental than I thought that I was. And with the understanding that I want to be right and they want to be right, and they want to take things out of books, we want to keep things in books. And yet everything that's written is not necessarily positive, and everything that's written is not necessarily true. And the balance of that has just really kind of hit me in the face that I don't know how to resolve that. But it's just kind of it's really cool to get out of my brain and think new thoughts and broader and wider thoughts.
Oh, Robin, you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Catherine. Georgianne, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Well, first off, I'd like to say that I just got the book from the library today because it was on hold for somebody else. And so I have not read the stories. I do have thoughts about the editing of classic books, however. And I have thoughts about how stories have changed. I mean, 100 years ago, it was 1920. And I don't think science fiction really had gotten started yet, except for Bram, whatever his name was, that wrote about Dracula. And well, there were a few very early things that they now connect to science fiction, but I don't think they were thought of as science fiction. They were horror stories at the time. So I think there's a lot of thoughts about the future that have been developed in literature that were fairly new during the 20th century. But about editing classic books, I think I'm personally not for that, because I think that they demonstrate the social times, and I think they can be taught with context, and maybe even with a lesson for how harmful this approach was to marginalized communities. Personally, I think it's better to take the bull by the horns than to bury it in the sand. So I don't really understand this desire to take all unpleasantness out of young people's lives. I mean, for heaven's sakes, they spend 8 hours a day killing people on their screens. So like, I don't see any reason we should protect them from just a little bit of attitudes that we no longer are in agreement with from the past. That's just my opinion.
Thank you for sharing. Lee, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
There we go. I want to comment on C. This situation, I think, is typical between groups that have different interests. And I think one way to do this is to, have a group, have a classroom, whatever, where you are forced to switch sides. So that if it's a, black and white thing, any black people that are there have to take this, pretend they're white and vice versa. And, to do their honest best to speak as if they are that different person, and see if that gives them empathy or at least a different feeling. I know I've watched things where, descendants, I guess, of Confederate soldiers or Confederate families or whatever, talk about, well, yeah, we should make sure that Black folks, get equality, but really, it was tough on the white people too. So there's still a residual, of trying to just be, their own race, let's say. So I think the best way to do it is to switch sides.
Thank you, Lee. Peg, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thanks, Robin. My comments about each of the three of these are, without classic literature and harmful content, offensive content, because it's iterative. What is offensive today maybe was not offensive 100 years ago, 200 years ago. I mean, look at Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, highly, highly derogatory. And even the song Yankee Doodle was a slight against the, now Americans. I mean, that was pejorative for them. And so I think that it's not so much telling stories or not telling stories, but in my mind, it's really about being able to have authors be given a voice. And then people will either read it and react or read it and not react. And I forget the name of our second story for tonight's reading, but right even in our own slide is the red warning sign. You know, this has extremely violent and it was graphic, you know. And so does that make it not valid? Does that mean those somewhat offensive parts should be edited out, or maybe the whole story be edited out? But at the same time, if we say yes, that all literature, all works of literature have should have the equal opportunity to be published and accessed, then also we open ourselves up as a group, and I'm not speaking for the group, but I'm just saying as a group, to the right to publish and or read points of view from the other side. So with every good comes, you know, another side to it. So long and short, I think that once we start editorializing or removing things that somebody finds controversial, because there'll be somebody who does not find it controversial, I think we get into a really bad space we don't want to be. So I don't think there should be any editing, but I think really we need to, as a society, be able to give a voice to authors of all backgrounds, of all types of representations. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you, Peg. Annette, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks, Robin. I'm in agreement about the classics be the classics, and let the classics inform us of the past. And I think we need to leave them alone. I think also mostly is that we need to make a real big distinction between literature and journalism and history. We're talking about two complete different ways of communicating through writing. One is fiction and the other one isn't. And so I think if we're writing in terms of journalism and history, then offensive language then becomes problematic. In terms of the last 100 years, what I would say is our memories only want to remember the good stuff. We don't like to remember the hard stuff, the difficult stuff, the controversial stuff. And it seems like the further away that you get from an event, the more it gets watered down and it gets the nitty-gritty of it. It gets taken out. So history is very complicated. History is very nuanced in a lot of ways. There's a lot of things that go, it's not a simple linear story, but in an effort to kind of get through it, it becomes linear and it becomes more fantasy and what we want it to be. And I do know that, reading books like the last one that we read and other books has completely changed my mind about my own history, our own history of the United States. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Annette. And Jamel, you wanted to add?
Yeah, just picking up on a couple of themes, and as it came out in one of the stories, the bookstore at the end of America. So there's this notion of what we control in terms of what's in books or what's actually written, and then there's this notion of how people try to control what others might look at, particularly parents and children. And in that story, Bookstore at the End of America, the whole idea is there is a space where all of this could coexist, and it just happened to be on the border. And the mother has a daughter, and what I found interesting was, she's like taught the daughter different things, but then there's a lot of a period where she just observes the daughter and lets the daughter kind of have her space, to associate with people from both sides of the spectrum. And I actually thought that, for me, what I picked up from the author there was, the tolerance that you actually need to create that space in which you're going to be willing to let other people have different thoughts or be exposed to different thoughts, and then hope that you have taught them well enough so that they can figure out ways to work out with one another. So it was an interesting book. It was among the stories, I actually felt like, although there's a very dark side to it because it's in the context of the war actually going on, I felt that there was a certain amount of hopefulness in there. And then just picking up on one of the things that Lee raised, with respect to race and trying to put yourself in another person's shoes or racial identity. There is a really interesting story that's not on our list today, and we'll get to it at some point, but I'll point it out, called The Blindfold, which actually is a very direct discussion of race in the judicial system and efforts to try to mask race from being part of judicial decisions. It's a short one, so I'll just throw that out as a little teaser to some other thoughts. But because you mentioned it, Lee, I thought I would point out that there's a story that gets into that directly.
Thank you, Jamil. Carol, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you. I believe that we should leave the classics alone and learn from them. And it's unfortunate that we have such negative treatment of people in our history. However, that's what happened. And we can discuss those things and learn from them and hopefully do better in the future. So that's my sense. And I feel like the stories that we read today are reflecting some of what we're living in our world today too.
Thank you, Carol. Faith, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Faith, if you could unmute.
We still can't hear you, Faith, if you're speaking.
Well, I wanted to make some quick comments, so I'll make mine and then we'll try to circle back around to Faith if we can. Just a couple quick things to address some of the comments. Another thing that I think is important to remember, we were talking about giving authors access and freedom to write stories 100 years ago. Even as recent as 20 years ago, not everyone had access to tell stories. There was a certain point in our history where an entire group of people were not allowed to read under threat of death. So they weren't sharing stories, they weren't telling stories. And the way that we talk about society through both literature and journalism is impacted by that. Is impacted by who gets to share their side of the story, who gets to share their experiences. So those represent what our classics are. And no, I don't think classics should be edited either, but I think that we need to be mindful of those key factors as well, when we go forward into talking about what stories we continue to pass down. Because a classic becomes a classic because 100 years later, we're still teaching those stories. Now we are in a point in our history where we have more access to people being able to share those stories, but are we actually sharing those with our children? Are we sharing them in our schools? Are we sharing them with each other? So if we continue to go back to the classics, we're continuing to go back and relive in stories in a time where a huge part of our population was not allowed to share their stories. And also to the point about history changing as we move through time, that's another thing that's impacted by this as well. Because shortly after history, in the book that we did just before this, I forget the name of it now, it says How We Win the Civil War. So much of our current history now is impacted by, or so much of our current events now, so much of the way we talk to each other now is informed by the way we taught history shortly after the Civil War happened. The way we taught history in the 30s, 40s, and 50s impacts people's views and their understandings of each other today. So I don't think harmful content should be removed. I don't think we should edit classics, but also we need to be mindful that we're not actually having these conversations. We're sharing the classics, we're rereading the classics, and we're actually not having these conversations. That's the piece of it that needs to change. So
Thank
Jane, I'm going to ask you to unmute, and then we're going to have to move on to the next question.
Okay. Hi, Robin. Hi, Jamel. Hi, Wes. It's good to see you guys again. I just wanted to add another thing. I can't unremember a time when I was in 4th grade, and a teacher who happened to be Black gave us some readings on slavery, and I was shielded from that my entire life because I lived in a very, well, I mean, the truth is I lived in a bigoted home. And when I read these things, I was really upset by them and crying, saying that I didn't feel this way. And so what my parents did was went straight to the school and had it out with the teacher, saying that, you know, that they don't want me reading this stuff. And to your point, Robin, that, I mean, all I know, even then I knew, look, if these things are happening, I need to know. I want to know. And let's talk about it. But we wouldn't talk about it. And I don't recall what conversations we did or didn't have in the classroom on that. I don't know, but I do know not enough was talked about it in, you know, throughout my life. But also as an educator, all of this, you know, these books, and I realize that there are things that are hurtful to certain cultures and communities and races and cultures all over that are written. But the truth is, what's more powerful, what's been written or what's actually having been lived out? And who really does have the power? The words in the book or the people reading those words? So we have got to allow ourselves to ask questions as we're reading, and to teach those who are reading these to ask questions. Critical thinking is imperative in a world of mis and disinformation. It's imperative when huge swaths of history are being left out or reframed or whitewashed. So I fear that in an attempt not to offend, that what we end up doing is creating just this mindless society. As you pointed out, Robin, we just follow along with what we've been told. We don't ask questions. We don't have the hard conversations.
Thank you, Jane. All righty, we're gonna give Faith one last chance, and then we really got to move on to the next question.
Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
How's everybody doing? I'm just calling to say this. When I was growing up, our parents were conscious as to everything that we did up until we graduated to high school. And that's what these parents need to do. Then you won't have this gun violence and all this killing and all this. All this stuff is coming from the way, not only I'm not prejudiced because I'm mixed, all races is getting worse and worse every year on the TV every single day of your life. And they need to put the prayer back in the school because
Oh,
I
please.
remember the day
So
that they
true.
took it out, the day they took the prayers out, that's when everything started happening. Because I recorded it. And that's all I got to say. We will be a better place to live and a better world to live in if we do what we're supposed to do as parents. We
I think
Faith?
I
Yeah,
think our mic got cut off.
I'm not sure what happened, Faith. Thank you for sharing. Appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm done.
All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So we're gonna head to appreciate what a great start, and we haven't even really dived into the actual books here. So we are gonna have to, because we got like 45 minutes. So may have to cut how many speakers we have just so that we can get through everything. But great start. And so we're gonna start with our first book in the bookstore. At the End of America, when people from America and California get trapped inside the bookstore, Phoebe eases tensions by starting an impromptu book club. Molly and Phoebe choose a book that appeals to and appeases people from both countries. And before we start our question, created a very simple Zoom poll question. And so I just launched it and it should be showing up on your screen. But the question is, how do you read books? Are you a physical copy reader or are you a digital copy reader? And I already see people responding. We've got 68% of participants. Oh, we're up to 72. I can't respond, and I know Jamel and Robin can't either. So, gonna
So
give it 20 more seconds.
I'll give a voice vote.
Go for it.
I've gotten used to the digital stuff because it's just easier to carry around. But I do like both.
I read primarily digitally, but I collect physical books. I have a lot.
And I see folks responding in the chat with some options as well. But I'm going to end the poll just for the sake of time. And now I'm going to share the results. And so 68% are physical copy, and then 32 are digital. And recognize some are both, and you could only pick a single choice. But interesting. I am a physical copy person because I'm not an auditory listener, so I get distracted. So appreciate.
Well, Audible,
wanted a
you didn't put
lighthearted fun.
Audible as a choice in there.
Oh yeah, I thought Audible digital, to be honest, but yeah, I'll have to redo it. Thank you all. Well, so we already kind of talked about this book, so we'll have a shorter discussion on this end. And so the question for our first selection is, what are some literary themes that you think speak to people from different backgrounds and ideologies? Kara, go ahead.
It is not a genre that I read at all, but romance, I think, is universal. Everybody wants to be in love or fall in love or learn about love. So, yeah, that's my, because everything else anymore is controversial. Wizards and sci-fi, I mean, everything is controversial, but love is good, right?
Love is controversial too. We've got racial
True.
preferences, and yeah, there's a lot of controversy in romance as well. Books that do and don't have main characters as people of color, people having racial preferences, fetishizing different racial groups, fetishizing people of different sexualities. I generally do agree with you, Kara, but I would say that there still is a lot of controversy in romance as well.
Thank you. Go ahead, Lee.
I'd suggest that something that everyone is concerned with, sometimes from different angles, is the idea of justice. Sometimes you feel like you haven't been treated justly, and sometimes in one group's pursuit of liberty, they infringe on the justice that ought to go to other groups. So I think this is a ripe thing that applies to everyone, because the preamble to our Constitution, the second thing after forming a more perfect union is to establish justice. That was the very second one. And I think, our founders thought that was the most important thing. Liberty fit underneath it. So I think, justice is paramount. People's personal lives, political lives, economic lives, et cetera.
Thank you, Lee. And as a progressive book club, it made me think of there's been a lot of talk, at least in the Twitter sphere, of President Biden and Vice President Harris's campaign re-election launch, very focused on freedom, and particularly how that's not something commonly talked about by progressives, but certainly is a topic that conservatives use. And so that's what I thought of when you first mentioned that. So thank you. Go ahead, Kamna. Good to see you.
You too. Thank you. What really struck me in this story, and it makes a lot of sense, is the genre of fantasy or something outside of our world, because that's what I think the daughter was writing a book like that. And then at the end, they landed on something. So I think if it's something that's of our earth and especially of our country, then people see themselves in it. Whereas if you have fantasy or otherworldly, or maybe even a allegory type of thing in a mythological past state, then people can maybe take themselves out of their ideologies.
Yeah, the escapism.
And it's interesting because that, from my understanding, and Wes, I know you're a teacher, so maybe you know more about this. It seems like younger people, high school, and even like just Gen Z, college and beyond, they're super into that genre. Like it's one of the most popular YA genres right now. And I wonder if that has something to do with it, that this earth is like, there's so much stress associated with climate change and politics and racial justice and everything going on, that they're like, let me just go to this other world.
Yeah. And particularly, it doesn't necessarily fit, maybe it's a literary theme, but graphic novels. They love graphic novels. And I don't know why, perhaps, but maybe someone else does. But like, because Robin, I think that to be able to escape, but then to me, the graphic novels, though, kind of like brings it to life as well. So, that connection. So yeah, so that's what my thoughts are doing right now. Robin, go ahead. Thank you, Kamna.
I was just going to say, merging almost everything everyone said. Jamel put in the comments, coming of age. Kamna's mentioned fantasy. Kara mentioned romance. And I think that was Lee who said justice. One of the most popular genres, I feel, is dystopian YA romance. And it has elements of all of that because it's always someone younger, usually a young teenage girl, coming of age story in a dystopian kind of fantasy-esque um world, but generally they're the hero. They are providing justice to a world that has become unjust. And a lot of times there are these fantastical elements to it where like new monsters have evolved or we've discovered magic or something like that. And there's always some type of romance in there as well. So it's funny you guys have picked these themes, and like a very popular subgenre is one that combines those together.
Thank you, Robin. Appreciate it. And I don't see any other hands. And so I think let's move on to the next one. And Jamel, do you want to take it?
Sure. Okay, there's a lot of text here. So in No Algorithms in the World, it appears that many people in the society have a guaranteed income and needs are generally provided for to the point where people may be able to work less, if at all. 3 questions. Do you believe that universal basic income is feasible? Why or why not? And what are your views of workfare? Some define human value by the work they produce and how much they work. Is it possible to decouple intrinsic human value from work? What determines value? What determines value in human activity? Is creating a piece of music more valuable than making a computer program or baking a cake? And the last question is, are we prepared for a world in which a key measurement of our self-worth is no longer our work? Do you judge yourself based on your work? And if so, when and how did that happen? So and just pulling a few threads here. Yeah, in the story is called No Algorithms in the World, in part because there's a certain amount of work that can be done by machines through algorithms that actually frees people up from doing some of the things that we're used to doing. There's a period during the Industrial Revolution where certain amount of machines began to take away some of the steps that were involved in manual labor. And we are going through some changes in our society, and we do have to prepare for some of this. So that's the context. I really enjoy. The story just made me think about a whole bunch of things. So Kara, you have your hand up, and then we'll get to Faith.
First of all, we 100% could do universal basic income because we basically did it during the pandemic. And we just have to tax the corporations and the billionaires appropriately, and we would have enough money to do everything that we always wanted to do in this country. But yeah, I feel like I 100% judge myself by the work that I do and how much work I get done and how much better I am at my work than everybody else. But maybe if I didn't have to work so much, I could find value in being better than everybody else at something else, like writing or whatever, like something I enjoy more. That would be awesome if I didn't have to work so much.
Thank you, Kara. One thing I'll throw in to the mix is that he mentions in the story, they make reference to the fact that in the Gulf states, the oil-rich states, the United Arab Emirates, there are some jurisdictions where they do have a universal basic income for the nationals, not necessarily for everybody in the country, and it's based on the fact that they've got all sorts of wealth from the oil extraction. It'll be interesting to see how people who grew up in that context, how they value and how they've changed. If anybody's familiar with that region, jump in if they've got any observations on that observation by the author. Faith.
Yes. Hi. I just want to say this. I'm used to the saying that you're the captain of your own ship and you're the captain of your own soul. As far as literature is concerned, I'm the type of person that I would do a one-on-one with people or with a group. You can do a one-on-one with a group as well. And all you do is present to those and see how they taste it. And once you know how the flavor is in their mouth, then you'll know how to project it. That's a gift in life that everybody should share. As far as money wise, everybody making money, everybody can make money in this world if other people let them. Some people, they see you doing good or you're getting somewhere and they're not. They try to bring you down to their level. Life is not like that. I'm also myself personally, I'm studying to be a minister, and what I'm doing is I'm giving back the knowledge that I've learned. Like I am the jack of all trades, queen of only three. And I'm what you call a CEO in manufacturing and in life and a lot of things. And I teach other people, they don't have to even be related to me. God will throw them into my path and I will get to working. That's the way this world should be. People are so busy being selfish. That's why we're in the position that we are in today. And that's all I got to say.
Thank you, Faith. And I think, and before you jump in, Robin, I see your hand up. You know, with the father in the story, No Algorithms in the World, was somebody who seemed to have a problem with other people getting things. You know, that was some kind of a threat to him, as opposed to, I guess, you know, feeling, well, what's wrong with having somebody else have a universal income? But Robin, you had your hand up.
I think, well, that's a great point that you make, Jamel, about the father, because I feel like it echoes a lot of rhetoric that we hear today, where we talk about people who don't deserve things, people on welfare wanting a handout. And I mean, one of the most common things I hear today is that people don't want to work. After the COVID pandemic, a lot of people didn't want to return to jobs where they felt that they were put into unsafe situations. And so now a common rhetoric is that people don't want to work. I kind of got the sense that the father probably existed in a time during a transition in our society. So he's like potentially our age. And then, you know, maybe in 30 years, their society figures out how to make universal basic income work. So you have some people who are transitioning from working to not working. And he grew up in a society like ours where we lived around that rhetoric. And it kind of goes back to what Kara was saying earlier as well. And I apologize, I think I might be mispronouncing your name, Kara. But talking about always needing to do better than people, outperforming other people, so much of our work in our life is defined, so much of our work and our worth is defined by our work. And the value of our work is defined in competition with everyone else. So it's never just we have a metric and you meet that metric. It's always you have to outperform someone else. This is the way that we talk about work. I think that universal basic income is feasible. And I think that decoupling and having people not define themselves by their work is feasible, because I think people do want to work. They maybe just don't want to be exploited for their work. They want to be valued for their work. And they also want to have a chance to determine what work they want to do. We choose what careers have more value. We undervalue teachers. We undervalue nurses. We undervalue caregivers. And so people who want to actually do those professions because they love those professions feel that they have to work themselves into the ground in order to survive. We have some of these other ways. I think people will still make those choices. We just won't have that element where we can exploit them for that work. None.
Thank you, Robin. Yeah, good points. Kamna, and then we've got Lee after that.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating topic in general. I coach people. I'm a career and life transitions coach, and I can't tell you how many people of every age, every demographic, I'll work with because they're dealing with like work-life balance issues or whatever, but they feel guilty if they're not working like 10 hours a day. They feel like they're not doing enough, and yet it's what's burning them out. So I think that the father's perspective, I loved his character because it was so spot on in terms of very American ideals in terms of what work should be. Because you talk to someone in Europe or other parts of the world, and they're like, "You all are crazy. You never take vacation. You like work all these hours." So one kind of tangential thought to that, I was just talking about this with a friend the other day, is I'm actually kind of hopeful that AI will kind of scoot us in the right direction, because if used properly in certain kinds of work, AI can actually trim some of those hours that we spend even like scheduling meetings or doing like all kinds of just administrative things. And if people can get more and more used to, oh wow, I'm doing something and it only takes me 4 hours to do it, I think that moves us in the direction of where the sun was, right? In terms of like, oh, I don't need to be like working in an office to do this. I can do other things that are meaningful. But I feel like there's a big arc. I think the pandemic and in white collar work, like the pandemic and remote work has started pushing us in that direction, but I just feel like we have a long ways to go. But I'm hopeful that we get there.
It's a really good point, Kamna. A lot of people are afraid of AI. Some others are welcoming it. It's a mixed bag. And before we get to Lee, I'll just say, one of the neat things about reading speculative fiction, this is what all these stories are called, speculative fiction, is that these authors can actually, they're free to create something in which they can really expose the underlying story. This author created the space in which, well, we don't know exactly how the government did it or how it got there, but the space, but he said, here is a world in which this happened. He doesn't have to worry about exactly how it got there. It's speculative. But it forces us to think about, well, what do we actually mean by work and value? Lee, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm retired now recently, and talked to a number of people about what they do in retirement. And it seems like everyone wants to be active. They are bored if they're not active. And I think if we expanded the definition of work to include sort of broadly activity that is meaningful to you one way or the other, whether it's maybe undervalued social work or creating a piece of music or working on the assembly line, all of them are activity that can be fulfilling. And I also remember Freud said the two important things that everyone needed to have to indulge in or to participate in were love and work. And myself, my wife accuses me of being a workaholic, but it's just because I want to be active. I think that engages you, whether it's your muscles or your brain. And so I think work is, I think it's always should be a part of, it should be coupled with human value, not decoupled.
Thank you, Lee. Great point. Really great point. And a lot of what's going on in France right now is, people, when they're told they have to work long, basically they've extended the age at which you work. People are reacting to the fact that, well, wait a second, there are other activities that I want to do other than work, when I am older in life. So they're quite concerned about how things are changing there. Robin.
So there was a question in the chat about whether or not there are any communities that implement universal basic income now. So if you look in the more information section in the reader's guide, there is the Stanford Basic Income Lab. There are actually several communities across the United States, several dozens actually have implemented test pilots of universal basic income, and it varies based on the city. Some ranged from a few $100s, $300, $400, $500 to maybe upwards of $1,000, $1,500. And also the duration was different. Some were, or the general was about like a year to 2 years or so. But that link is in the reader's guide. It's in the more information section. The Stanford Basic Income Lab has a link to different communities that have implemented universal basic income basically as trials to see not only if economically the municipalities could afford to make it work, but also to study how it impacts people who were given that universal basic income.
Okay, well, I think that's really helpful background stuff, and I do encourage, we encourage folks to look at some of these extra links that Robin has provided. It just makes a reading that much more interesting, when you can dig into some stuff afterwards as well. I think we should move on to the next question at this point. And Robin, is that with you, or is it Wes? I don't know.
Rock, paper, scissors. Okay, I'll go.
So is there another slide? Because my next slide is, we're done. Did we get through?
You just skipped it. This is the next one. Yeah, right
here. Oh, sorry.
The sun in exile. Yeah.
It's really hard to balance, folks. I'm sorry when I'm trying to lower hands, see what's going on in the chat. So apologies. My bad. Go ahead, Robin.
Okay. Sorry, I need to pull it up on the meeting notes because I can't read it on the screen. In The Sun in Exile, a charismatic leader determines what is true and what is false and uses an obvious lie to convince his followers that a devastating climate disaster is not actually happening. So when I was researching authoritarianism for this story in question, I ended up finding out that there is actually a sociological concept called charismatic authority. And you'll see there at the bottom of your screen, I did put a definition there, but it is a type of organization or leadership in which authority derives from the charisma of the leader. So with that in mind, our 4 questions for this question, for this story. Should leaders be held accountable for their actions and the things that they say? If so, how do we hold them accountable? Should leaders be held accountable for the actions of their followers? It can be said that they are effective and almost necessary in mobilizing a political base. Charismatic leaders, I should clarify that question. How do we balance our emotional responses to charismatic leaders while at the same time remaining critical, mindful, and thoughtful about the messages that they are propagating? Is it possible to maintain or restore democracy under charismatic authoritarian leadership? And here's another place also where I'm going to point you guys to the more information section there as well. because charisma, a charismatic leader is almost kind of like a foundational basis of how they lead. But there were two types of charismatic leaders that were defined there: social and personal. So a social charismatic leader, they defined people similar to like Martin Luther King Jr. He was very charismatic and mobilized people, but he had an agenda to further equality and justice. Personal charismatic leaders are defined, people like Hitler is defined as a personal charismatic leader, where he had gains towards always wanting to be seen as infallible, as being seen as always correct, as being very intelligent. So we do have two different types of charismatic leaders that were defined there. So any thoughts on any of those?
I see Beulah has said, what would you call a Jim Jones there, Robert? Jim Jones was the in Guyana, with who basically led folks into a mass suicide. Is that right? Do I have that right? Yeah, Lee is raising, people are shaking their head. I think he would be in that second category. But I think I interrupted. Carol had her hand up.
Okay. I'm gonna ask you to unmute.
The story made me think of the children's story of the Emperor's New Clothes. It was just so absurd, and I'm glad that you pointed out a positive charismatic leader, because my thoughts went to who I consider to be negative charismatic leaders. And that last question, is it possible to maintain and restore democracy? I sure hope so. I sure hope so.
Yeah, me too.
And I don't think I need to say more.
Thank you, Carol. Annette, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Thank you. Should leaders be held accountable? Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the biggest frustrations that we on the left are having is the fact that our previous president is not being held accountable. So absolutely, they should be held accountable. And what is the very last question about? Can charismatic leaders, something about authoritarian, would you repeat the question? I can't see the question and y'all at the same time because I'm on the tablet. Say that again.
Is it possible to maintain or restore democracy under charismatic authoritarian leadership? Sorry, tongue-tied there.
I think they're contradictory. I don't think you can have a charismatic authoritarian leader and democracy. You can have a charismatic leader, but that charismatic leader has to be more than just charismatic. That leader has to have more than just a personality. That leader has to have a mission, has to have vision, has to have morals, has to have ethics. But charism is not enough for true leadership. Obviously, there are leaders who that's all they have is charism, and they lead us down a very dark path. But excuse some of my passion, but I've just been doing a lot of reading into if any of you are familiar with Timothy Snyder, he's talking about this very he's talking about this very thing, and what is leading us into a country that is becoming less and less free. So yeah, I feel very passionate about some of those questions, and that's all I'll say for now. Thank you.
Thank you. No, don't apologize for your passion. We appreciate it. But I would say to, again, just to point you guys to the more information section, further to your point, we do have some readings there about just the psychology of why people can be susceptible to charismatic leaders. So that's another reference there too. Lee, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Okay. So I agree with whoever it was that said that and D, that it was contradictory of democracy and authoritarian leadership. And what I think we have here in this country, and I want to suggest a reading too to everybody, is we're almost, we still could fall under serious authoritarian leadership. Hitler and Mussolini basically created a situation where about 60 million people died. And many, many years happened before democracy started to resurrect itself. So once authoritarianism gets embedded in the United States, that's happening more and more in the States. It's really, really difficult to change it. So you can't maintain democracy, and to restore it sometimes takes decades, half of people's lifetimes. And it's, the work that has to be done is immediate. It's on a local level, it's on a state level, it's on a national level. All of it counts. But those are two absolutely contradictory things. So for D, I would say you have to get it before authoritarianism really takes hold. Because if you don't, you're down a really horrible road where basically there are other places. Chile is one, Hungary currently is one. Turkey may be one, where this is happening, and people are about to get subsumed by this wave of authoritarianism.
Agreed. Thank you, Lee. Beulah, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
I was going to say that we're experiencing that in some manner ourselves, because if we weren't going down that road, we wouldn't have January 6th situation have happened. And now people going to knock on somebody's door, pulling into somebody's driveway, a ball rolling into somebody's yard, that the people begin to think that's okay because that's been put out there, maybe not plain as day, but it has an effect on the person's mind that this is okay. So our previous president tried to be I associate him with being sort of like a Hitler wannabe, a Putin wannabe, because he wanted to have absolute authority.
Agreed. Yeah. Thank you, Beulah. So I'll just add really quickly also, we need to have in regards of how we hold leaders accountable, we need to, I feel, have very clearly defined expectations for our leaders, and we need to hold them to that. I think that that's a lot of what happened, especially around this new stuff with like Fox News being sued by Dominion. They were basically able to lie for a really long time. And even with the judgment, they didn't have to retract it. They didn't have to go onto their platform and say, we knowingly provided a falsehood. They were not required to do that. And I get that they're not a leader, but in some regards, they can be considered a thought leader. And it hurts them in their pockets. But I think that's also one of the kind of downsides to a capitalist society where we have large concentrations of wealth, because we saw a lot of this happen in the employment sector as well. We have laws to protect people, and if you have enough money, you can just pay your way out of it, which is essentially what Fox did. We learned about this when we read The Sum of Us, that a lot of employers were breaking laws meant to protect people. And because they had enough money, they would literally just write it onto their bottom line. They would write it into their budget. And that's similar to what some of these thought leaders are doing, that for them, it's a calculation, and for them, it's worth it. Jamil, we're gonna go ahead and, oops, sorry, I muted you.
That's okay. I was just going to say, I mean, I think that the concept of servant leadership, has come up in this group before. And when you describe those different types of charismatic leaders, I look at, okay, are they using their charisma to essentially be a servant to the people, answering a call to respond to a need, or are they looking for the people to be their servants? And that's I think one of the things that I've always felt very strongly about in this country is that people really do believe that government is accountable to the people. But to the extent that we don't make our leaders accountable, that gets eroded, and that is it's something that's separated the United States from many other countries in the past, is the notion of people truly believing that the government is meant to be the servant of the people. I mean, it's not always true, but it's something that we've felt strongly about. I think I might have raised it in this group in the past, but if you were an American citizen and you are overseas and something goes wrong, you go to the embassy and you basically say, help me out, because it's your job. There's that notion that they are there they should be there to help you. And I think that embassy officials actually feel that, whereas in many other countries, the last place that they might go to if they were having trouble is to their own embassy. So that's something that we have that I just hope we don't lose.